March 1945. Okinawa Prefecture. The air smelled of salt and ash. Along the fractured cliffs of southern Okinawa, where the earth had been churned by artillery into unrecognizable wounds, a young woman named Kimiko Tanaka crouched in a limestone cave. Her hands cracked and bloodied, clutched a tin cup containing 3 grains of rice suspended in muddy water. She had not eaten a full meal in 11 days. Outside, the thunder of American naval guns rolled across the Pacific like the voice of an angry god. Inside, in the damp darkness, 37 women and children pressed against one another for warmth, their breath forming small clouds in the cold. They whispered prayers to ancestors they believed they would soon join. Kimiko had been told many things about the Americans. She had been told they were demons with blue eyes who ate the flesh of children. She had been told they would violate women and parade their bodies through the streets as trophies. She had been told that death was preferable to capture, that the emperor's divine will demanded sacrifice. That surrender was a betrayal not only of nation, but of the eternal spirit of Yamato. For 2 years, she had worked in a military laundry unit, washing the uniforms of soldiers who left for the front and never returned. For 2 years, she had believed in victory, in the invincibility of the imperial forces, in the righteousness of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Now, as the walls of the cave trembled and dust fell like fine snow, she believed only in hunger. The concept of the enemy in war is a carefully constructed fiction. It is built from propaganda posters, from government broadcasts, from whispered stories told by those who have never seen the face of the foreigner. It is sustained by fear and nourished by absence. For the women of Japan, those who had served in auxiliary roles, in nursing units, in communications posts, in the vast logistical machinery that kept an empire at worth, an image of the American soldier was a nightmare given shape. They had seen the photographs distributed by the Kempeitai, the military police. Images of American brutality in China, of conquered peoples humiliated, of cities reduced to rubble. They did not know that many of these images were fabrications, that the machinery of total war required not only soldiers, but the manipulation of truth. When the Americans finally came, they came not as Kimiko expected. On the morning of March 24th, as dawn broke pale and uncertain over the Pacific, a voice echoed through a loudspeaker in broken Japanese. "Women and children, come out. You will not be harmed. We have food and water. Come out." The words felt like a trap. In the cave, mothers held their children closer. Some women had already tied strips of cloth around their necks, prepared to strangle themselves rather than face capture. Kimiko looked at her tin cup, at the 3 grains of rice that had sustained her through the night, and made a calculation that millions before her had made. The known certainty of death versus the unknown possibility of mercy. She emerged into daylight with her hands raised. Behind her, one by one, the others followed. They expected bullets. They expected violence. What they received instead was a canteen of clean water and a piece of chocolate wrapped in foil. The American soldier who handed it to her was young, perhaps 19, with freckles across his sunburned nose. He smiled awkwardly, said something in English she did not understand, and gestured toward a row of trucks idling on the road. Kimiko held the chocolate in her palm as if it were a live grenade. She did not eat it for 3 hours. The journey to the prisoner of war camp took 2 days. The women were transported in open-bed trucks along roads cratered by shells. Past villages that no longer existed, past fields where the sugar cane had been burned to stubble. They did not speak. They sat in silence, each alone with the terrible realization that they had broken the ultimate taboo. They had chosen survival over honor. In the traditional framework of Bushido, the warrior code that had been adapted and distorted to serve the needs of imperial expansion, surrender was a stain that could never be washed away. Women, though not samurai, had been taught that they too must embody this principle. The phrase "death before dishonor" was not merely a slogan. It was a cultural commandment reinforced by centuries of feudal tradition and 2 decades of militaristic indoctrination. The camp itself was a hastily constructed facility on the western coast of Okinawa, A sprawl of tents and wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing. As the trucks rolled through the gates, Kimiko saw something that made no sense. Rows of women sitting on benches in the open air, eating from metal trays. Steam rose from the food. She could smell it: rice, vegetables, something else she could not identify. Her stomach contracted painfully. The truck stopped, and the women were directed toward a processing area where American soldiers and Japanese interpreters recorded their names, ages, and units of service. Then they were led to a long tent where tables had been set with plates and utensils. "Sit," the interpreter said. "You will eat now." The women sat. They stared at the plates. On each was a mound of white rice, a portion of stewed vegetables with chunks of pork, a slice of bread, and a small tin cup of miso soup. It was more food than Kimiko had seen in a month. More food than many of these women had seen since the American blockade had begun choking the Japanese supply lines. They did not move. Some began to weep silently. An American officer, a captain with a neatly pressed uniform and round spectacles, stood at the entrance to the tent. Through the interpreter, he said, "This is your meal. You will receive 3 meals like this every day: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You are prisoners, but you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will not be harmed. You will not go hungry." The concept was incomprehensible. In the Japanese military system, hierarchy and deprivation were inseparable. Soldiers in the Imperial Army often went days without adequate food, their rations reduced to hardtack and pickled radish. Comfort women and auxiliary personnel fared even worse, their needs subordinated entirely to the demands of combat units. The idea that an enemy would feed its prisoners, feed them well, feed them daily, feed them with the kind of abundance that even Japanese civilians could no longer imagine, contradicted everything they understood about war and power. Kindness, in their framework, was a weakness. Generosity was a lie, but the food was real. Slowly, hesitantly, Kimiko picked up a spoon and brought a small portion of rice to her lips. It was warm. It tasted of salt and faint sweetness. She swallowed, and her body responded with a violence of need that frightened her. She began to eat quickly, almost desperately, shoveling the rice into her mouth until the interpreter gently placed a hand on her shoulder and said, slowly, "You will make yourself sick." Across the tent, other women were experiencing the same shock, the same disbelief. Some ate and then vomited, their bodies unable to process the sudden influx of nutrition. Others ate and cried, overwhelmed by the collision of physical relief and psychological torment. To be fed by the enemy was to be indebted to the enemy. To accept their food was to accept their mercy. And mercy, in the ideology they had been raised within, was a concept reserved for the strong bestowing favor upon the weak. They had been taught that Americans were barbarians without culture, without refinement, without the spiritual depth that defined Japanese superiority. Yet here they were, eating pork and rice prepared by these barbarians, sitting under canvas tents erected by these barbarians, alive because these barbarians had chosen not to kill them. The records kept by the Allied forces document this phenomenon with clinical precision. Reports from the Okinawa Civilian and POW Administration, declassified decades later, note that Japanese women prisoners initially refused food at rates as high as 30%, citing fear of poison or shame at accepting enemy provisions. Medical officers reported cases of severe malnutrition among captives, with average body weights 15 to 20% below normal ranges. Caloric intake for women in combat zones during the final months of the Pacific War had dropped to between 800 and 1,200 calories per day, barely enough to sustain basic metabolic function, far below what was needed for physical labor or psychological resilience. By contrast, the standard POW ration provided by American camps was designed to deliver approximately 2,500 to 3,000 calories daily, with adjustments for age and health status. This was not generosity born of sentiment. It was policy rooted in international law and logistical capability. The United States, untouched by direct invasion, possessed agricultural and industrial resources that dwarfed those of any other combatant nation. Abundance was not a luxury. It was a structural reality. But to the women in the camp, this abundance felt like a form of psychological warfare. Each meal delivered was a reminder of their own nation's failure. Japan, they had been told, was divinely protected. The emperor was a living god, and his people were chosen for a sacred mission to liberate Asia from Western imperialism. Yet here they were, defeated and dependent, eating food grown in California and Iowa, transported across an ocean that Japan had claimed as its own. The rice they ate was American rice. The bread was baked by American hands. Even the miso soup, prepared by Japanese cooks, hired by the American administration to ease the cultural transition, was made from ingredients supplied by American logistics networks. The symbolism was inescapable. In traditional Japanese culture, food carries profound social and spiritual significance. The sharing of a meal is an act of communion, a ritual that binds individuals to family, to community, to nation. The rice bowl is sacred. To waste even a single grain is considered disrespectful to the farmers who labored to produce it. During the war, this cultural reverence for food had been weaponized by the state. Propaganda posters urged citizens to eat sparingly for the emperor, to embrace hunger as a patriotic virtue. Women in particular were exhorted to sacrifice their own nourishment for the sake of soldiers at the front. To accept deprivation as evidence of loyalty, the government distributed pamphlets with recipes for stretching rations, how to make soup from fish bones, how to cook seaweed into edible paste, how to extract nutrients from acorns and tree bark. Starvation was reframed as discipline. Suffering was rebranded as strength. Against this backdrop, the daily hot meals in the American camps were an ideological assault. Each plate of food was a counter-narrative, a tangible argument against everything the prisoners had been taught. If the Americans could feed their enemies while their own soldiers were well supplied, what did that say about the supposed moral superiority of Japanese austerity? If abundance was possible, even in the midst of global conflict, what did that reveal about the competence of the imperial government? The women did not articulate these questions openly. Such thoughts were dangerous, even in captivity, but they felt them. They felt them in the weight of the rice bowls, in the warmth of the soup, in the unfamiliar sweetness of canned fruit served as dessert. One woman, a former nurse named Haruko Saito, later wrote in a memoir published in 1962 that the moment she fully understood, her situation came not during the battle, not during the surrender, but during her fourth dinner in the camp. The meal that evening included a small portion of chicken, a rarity even before the war. She had not tasted chicken in 3 years. As she ate, she found herself thinking not of the emperor, not of Japan, not of honor or shame, but of her mother's kitchen in Hiroshima, of the smell of shoyu and ginger, of a time before the world had collapsed into fire and iron. She wrote, "I realized then that I was not thinking as a soldier or a subject. I was thinking as a human being who was hungry and who had been fed. The Americans had returned to me something I had forgotten, the simple fact of my own hunger." This awakening was not immediate for all. Many women struggled with profound guilt, a sense that they had betrayed not only their nation but themselves. The camp administrators, aware of this psychological turmoil, made efforts to provide not only physical sustenance but cultural familiarity. Japanese-speaking staff members were recruited to serve as liaisons. Buddhist and Shinto shrines were permitted within the campgrounds. Prisoners were allowed to write letters to family members, though these were censored and few ever reached their destinations, as much of Japan's postal infrastructure had been destroyed. Educational programs were established, teaching basic English and vocational skills. The goal, as articulated in military directives, was to rehabilitate prisoners, to prepare them for reintegration into a post-war society that would be radically different from the one they had known. But the most powerful rehabilitation tool was the meal itself. 3 times a day, every day, the women gathered in the mess tents and ate. Over weeks and months, the ritual became routine. The initial shock faded into something more complex, a grudging acceptance, then a tentative gratitude, and finally, for some, a quiet reassessment of what they had believed about the world. They began to notice details. The American soldiers who served the food were not cruel. They were often friendly, sometimes awkward, occasionally kind. The Japanese cooks hired by the camp, former civilians who had also been captured, spoke of the Americans with a mixture of bewilderment and pragmatic respect. "They follow rules," one cook said. "They have rules for everything, even for feeding us." This observation, mundane on its surface, carried profound implications. Rules implied order. Order implied civilization. And civilization, they had been told, was the exclusive domain of the Japanese Empire. The historical record supports these accounts with data that underscores the disparity in treatment between prisoners in Allied versus Japanese custody. According to research compiled by historians such as Gavin Dawes and published in works like Prisoners of the Japanese, the death rate for Allied POWs held by Japan ranged from 25 to 30%, a figure that climbed even higher in certain camps and labor sites. Starvation, disease, overwork, and summary execution were commonplace. By contrast, the death rate for Japanese POWs in American custody was less than 3%. With most fatalities attributed to illness or injuries sustained before capture, these numbers are not merely statistics. They represent fundamentally different philosophies of warfare and humanity. The Japanese military, shaped by a culture that valorized death over surrender, had no institutional framework for treating prisoners with dignity. The Americans, for all their own moral failings and prejudices, operated within a legal and ethical system that at least aspired to humanitarian standards. For the women in the Okinawa camp, this difference was lived experience. As weeks turned into months, their bodies began to recover. Weight was regained. Skin regained its color. Hair, which had been brittle and falling out from malnutrition, grew thicker. But the psychological recovery was slower and more fraught. Many women grappled with survivor's guilt, haunted by the knowledge that millions of their compatriots were still suffering. News of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki reached the camp in August 1945, delivered through hushed conversations and official announcements. The women learned that the war was over, that Japan had surrendered unconditionally, that the emperor himself had spoken to the nation via radio, a voice most had never heard, a voice that commanded them to endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. In the days following the surrender, the camp's atmosphere shifted. The guards became less vigilant. The interpreters spoke more openly. Plans were made for repatriation, though the logistics were daunting. Japan's ports were damaged, its cities burned, its infrastructure shattered. The women waited, ate their 3 meals a day, and tried to imagine what home would look like. Some feared they would have no home to return to. Others feared that even if their houses still stood, they would no longer be welcome. The stigma of captivity, of having chosen life over death, would follow them. In a society that revered martyrdom, survivors were often viewed with suspicion. Kimiko Tanaka, who had clutched 3 grains of rice in a cave on Okinawa, was eventually repatriated to Japan in November 1945. She returned to a village that had been partially destroyed by firebombing. Her family's home was gone. Her father had died in the war. Her mother had succumbed to starvation the previous winter. Kimiko found shelter with a distant aunt and began the long, painful process of rebuilding her life. In interviews conducted decades later, she spoke about her time in the American camp with a complexity that defied easy categorization. "I was ashamed," she said. "I was grateful. I was confused. I was alive." When asked what she remembered most vividly, she did not speak of the battles or the bombs. She spoke of the rice. "It was always warm," she said. "Every day, 3 times a day, it was warm." The symbolism of the hot meal in this context transcends its function as mere sustenance. It becomes a metonym for a larger ideological confrontation. The warmth of the rice represented the capacity for care, even in the midst of conflict. The regularity of the meals represented reliability, quality that the Japanese government, in its final desperate years, had utterly failed to provide. The abundance of the portions represented a different kind of power, the destroy, but the power to create, to nourish, to sustain. For women who had been taught that sacrifice and suffering were the highest virtues, the American approach was disorienting. It suggested that perhaps strength did not require cruelty, that victory did not necessitate starvation, that there might be other ways to organize a society. This realization did not come easily or uniformly. Many women remained loyal to the emperor and to the ideals they had internalized. Some refused to eat for days at a time, viewing the food as a form of contamination. Others ate but maintained a psychological distance, framing their acceptance of American provisions as a temporary expedience, a survival strategy that did not imply moral compromise. But over time, the repetition of the ritual, the daily gathering, the shared meals, the gradual return to health wore down the rigid ideological barriers. Food has a way of breaking through abstraction. Hunger is universal. Satiation is undeniable. The camp kitchens, staffed by a mix of American cooks and Japanese civilian employees, operated with an efficiency that itself conveyed a message. Supplies arrived on schedule. Ingredients were fresh, or as fresh as military logistics could manage. The meals were nutritionally balanced, designed by dietitians to address the specific deficiencies common among malnourished populations. This was not charity in the sentimental sense. It was policy informed by science, by bureaucracy, by the vast organizational capacity of the American war machine. Yet to the recipients, the distinction mattered little. What mattered was the tray placed before them, the steam rising from the rice, the sound of metal spoons against metal plates, the small daily miracle of not being hungry. In her memoir, Haruko Saito, the former nurse, recounted a conversation with an American officer who had studied anthropology before the war. He told her, through an interpreter, that he believed the conflict between Japan and the United States was fundamentally a conflict of philosophies. Your leaders told you that suffering makes you strong, he said. My country believes that prosperity makes you strong. You were taught to endure. We were taught to improve. Maybe both are true. Maybe neither is. But right now, we have more food than we know what to do with, and you are starving. So we feed you. Not because we are good, but because we can. This pragmatic framing of generosity not as virtue, but as capability, was perhaps more honest than any propaganda could have been. It acknowledged the material realities that underlay the war's outcome. Japan had attempted to conquer an empire with limited resources and an economy already strained by decades of militarization. The United States had entered the war with an industrial base that could outproduce the rest of the world combined. The meals served in the POW camps were not evidence of moral superiority. They were evidence of logistical dominance. And yet, to the women who ate them, the distinction was immaterial. They were alive. They were fed. And in that simple fact, they began to see the outline of a different future. The epilogue of this story is written not in official records, but in the lives that followed. Many of the women who passed through the Okinawa camp, and others like it, went on to live long lives in post-war Japan. They became teachers, shopkeepers, mothers, grandmothers. They rarely spoke of their experiences, in part because Japanese society preferred to forget the shame of defeat. The narrative of the war that emerged in the decades that followed emphasized victimhood, the atomic bombs, the firebombings, the suffering of civilians, while downplaying collaboration, militarism, and the atrocities committed in Japan's name. The women who had been prisoners occupied an uncomfortable space in this narrative. They were neither heroes nor victims in the traditional sense. They were survivors who had made choices that the culture did not wish to examine, but in private, some kept small tokens. A metal spoon stolen from the mess tent, a scrap of paper with an American soldier's name scribbled in English, a recipe for a dish they had tasted in the camp and tried to recreate at home, though the ingredients were never quite right. These objects became relics of a liminal time, a bridge between the world that was and the world that came after. They were reminders that history is not only the story of nations and ideologies, but also the story of individuals making impossible calculations under unbearable pressure. The hot meals served in those camps did more than fill stomachs. They challenged a narrative, one meal at a time. They posed a question that the Japanese Empire could not answer. If the enemy can feed you when your own leaders cannot, What does that say about the system you were told to die for? This was not a question that could be resolved with propaganda or censorship. It was a question answered by the body, by the elemental truth of hunger satisfied. And once that question was asked, once that truth was felt, the old certainties began to crumble. In the end, the story of these women is not about American benevolence or Japanese suffering in isolation. It is about the collision of ideologies made manifest in the most basic human need. It is about the power of abundance to undermine the mythology of sacrifice. It is about how 3 meals a day, delivered with mechanical regularity, can unravel decades of indoctrination. The rice was always warm. The portions were always sufficient. And in that simple, daily repetition, a different kind of truth emerged, one that could not be denied, could not be explained away, could not be forgotten. Decades later, when historians and journalists sought out these women to record their testimonies, many struggled to articulate what the experience had meant. The language of trauma and survival, of propaganda and deprogramming, felt inadequate. One woman, speaking in 1989, at the age of 73, paused for a long time when asked what she wanted people to understand. Finally, she said, "We were told that the Americans were monsters. But monsters do not cook rice for their prisoners. Monsters do not make sure the soup is hot. I do not know what that makes them. I do not know what that makes us. I only know that I am alive, and I am grateful, and I am still confused." That confusion, that refusal of easy answers, is perhaps the most honest legacy of those camps. The meals did not erase the war. They did not justify the deaths or heal the wounds. But they did something else, something quieter and more profound. They insisted 3 times a day, every day, that even in the midst of total war, even between enemies, the basic act of feeding the hungry was possible, that it was policy, that it was routine. And in a world that had descended into unprecedented violence, that small, daily insistence on the possibility of care was its own form of resistance against the abyss. The steam rising from a bowl of rice, the weight of a spoon in a trembling hand, the quiet ritual of meals shared among strangers who had been told they were demons. These are the images that endure long after the guns fell silent, long after the camps were dismantled, long after the women returned to a homeland that no longer existed in the form they remembered. The hot meals were not redemption. They were not forgiveness. They were simply, profoundly, undeniably real. And sometimes, in the algebra of human experience, reality is the most revolutionary force of all.